Unfortunately, these have been rare exceptions. As I've explained, the majority of countries developed and developing have allowed inequalities to soar, often pressured by the self-interests of richer groups and encouraged, unfortunately, by beliefs that actions to set limits on inequalities, let alone reduce them, would discourage economic growth. And the research does not show that. It's important to realize that. It's not true that if you take action through in various ways, and I'll come to it, in order to moderate extremes of inequalities, growth suffers. Indeed, there's a number of good arguments to suggest that if done in the right way, growth will gain. Before completing this quick overview, let me contrast the quiet and often complicit attitude of many economists and other analysts today, faced with soaring inequalities, with the unfettered language of some of the early giants of the economic profession. I thought these would be both useful and I hope sometimes the expressions show that you needn't be too cautious. Adam Smith, for example, wrote, I quote, wherever there is great property, there is great inequality. For one very rich man, there must be at least 500 poor, and the affluence of the few supposes the indigence of the many. Even that is rather modest language. John Stuart Mill pointed to the critical role of legislation in the process of increasing inequality, and how a different process would have shown the positive roles of private property. If, he wrote, the tendency of legislation had been to favor the diffusion of wealth instead of its concentration, to encourage the subdivision of the large accumulation instead of striving to keep it all together, the principle of individual property would have been found to have no necessary connection with the physical and social evils which almost all socialist writers assume to be inseparable from it. And then let me quote from Thomas Paine, who lived a wonderful 6 years in my hometown, Lewis, and who was not restrained by language. On the one side, he wrote, the spectator is dazzled by splendid appearances. On the other, he is shocked by extremes of wretchedness. And he added that civilization, today we would call it globalization, has operated in two ways: to make one part of society more affluent and the other part more wretched than would have been the lot of either in a natural state. And now, to wake everyone up, Paine also added some words which fit one or two of those who the Paine seats in the House of Lords are not in the slightest referring to you, Frank. Those in the House of Lords who still pay no taxes. Blush, said Thomas Paine, blush, aristocracy, to hear your origin, for your progenitors were thieves. When they had committed the robbery, and he was in that point, I think, referring to the enclosure movement, they endeavored to lose the disgrace by sinking their real names under fictitious ones, which they called titles. And added, it is ever the practice of felons to act in this manner. And now, to zip back to the present, Robert Peston, with whom I began, has pointed out the dangers if such influence continues. And I quote, the new super-rich have the means through the financing of political parties, the funding of think tanks, and the ownership of the media to shape government policies or to deter reform of the status quo that suits them. That was written last year by the BBC correspondent. Okay. Inequality and the MDGs, and the need for what I should call redistributive growth. So what are the links between inequality and the achievement of the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, even though most documents don't bring in inequality at all, unfortunately? There are four main links. Inequality is linked to the rate and structure of economic growth. It is linked to public expenditure and taxation, and indeed to aid and the conditions of international support. It is linked, and this is important, to the factors which influence who succeeds and who fails to get access to education, health, social protection, boys and girls, as well as the marginalized and others. And fourthly, inequality is linked to human security. I want to say just a little about each of these, but I want to stress that inequality influences the rate and structure of economic growth, just as the rate and structure of economic growth influences inequality in a country. And this two-way relationship is true of each of the other three links that I mentioned. Let me illustrate. For MDG 1, which I hope you will remember, is for the reduction of poverty and hunger by 2015, and linked increasingly to increasing decent employment and, let's admit, economic growth and the form of macroeconomic strategy. But too often the focus in orthodox analysis of the MDGs, and certainly in the World Bank and the IMF, has been almost entirely on achieving higher rates of economic growth, not on the structure of growth, with inequality left out in the cold. If inequality is mentioned, it is more often to suggest that any attempt to reduce inequality will mean a cutting of incentives and therefore a cause for a reduction in growth rates, which, as I've already said, research does not confirm. In contrast, the draft report of the UN Development Group on the MDGs, issued last month and which was presented in the meeting I've just been at in Istanbul, states the following, and I was delighted to see it. If poverty goals are to be met, a large redistributive process is needed. This redistribution might not be in terms of income or wealth, but in terms of economic growth. In other words, it continued, to reach the MDGs for reducing poverty and hunger, the poor must achieve higher growth rates than the non-poor. Specific policies should aim at this. Some of you might remember that 30 or so years ago, ILO issued a report on basic needs. They calculated that to reduce poverty within a generation, 25 years, a rate of growth of 8 to 10% of the poor income of the poorest would be needed. They thought 8 to 10% growth rate in general was far too high, so they calculated that a reasonable rate would be 6% per year. Even that historically is quite high. But then what would be needed would be a process of adjusting the growth rate so that the poorest within it grew more like 8 to 10% and the richer groups grew more slowly. That would be redistributive growth. And indeed, there was an argument that was developed in a document that I had a hand in, I'm proud to say, with the World Bank and with the IDA Sussex in the 1970s, called Redistribution with Growth, elaborating how it could be done. But how realistic is that? I can hear not people in this audience, but in many audiences say. The argument against redistributive growth from political naysayers. It's simply, it's nice to hear you, Professor Jolly, but it doesn't happen. Let's be realistic. It doesn't happen. Let me give you some examples. Redistributed growth, pro-poor growth as it's sometimes called, as I've already been mentioned, has taken place in Brazil and 10 other Latin American countries which applied such policies in the early 2000s.